Morals in Man, Part 4. Legalism, then, on the objective side, precludes all possibility of morality being expressible in hedonist, utilitarian, eudaimist terms. On the side of the subject, it refuses to regard the search for happiness as an acceptable motive, and in general substitutes for the idea of choosing the right means to an end that of duty for duty's sake. This point of view was strongly urged by Kant in his Metaphysic of Morals. Butler, in his discussion of the psychology of morality, had distinguished three principles regulative of action: self-love, benevolence, and conscience. And it was from the recognition in his dissertation on virtue of the fact that the dictates of conscience may not coincide with conclusions as to what is conducive to the general happiness that the battle between the intuitionists and utilitarians took its rise. But do self-love and conscience coincide? Self-love, in Butler's sense, is not hedonist self-seeking. He calls it reasonable self-love, and means by it the cool and reflective aiming at one's own happiness. But what does he mean by happiness? There is the usual terminological difficulty. Butler does not, like Hutchinson, explicitly include perfection in his definition, but he does distinguish happiness from pleasure and talks of the course of life. Our real nature points out, a definitely eudaimonist concept which is strengthened by his definition of virtue as what is according to nature, and his account of nature itself, which the notion of end and completion is urged in the analogy of the watch. For as this is fitted by the relations of its parts to measure time, so human nature is fitted to achieve virtue, and thus far the cases are perfectly parallel, there being only this difference that a machine is inanimate and passive, but we are agents. So it is that in his ethical discussion of the relative authority of conscience and reasonable self-love, or, in other words, of duty and interest, Butler can say that the two coincide for the most part in this world, but entirely if we take in the future. And it is this recognition of the coincidence of teleology and deontology which brings him so close to the Thomist view. For Kant, such a synthesis was out of the question. Teleology for his age meant utilitarianism. It was this he was attacking, and he came therefore to hold that, so far from interest being a principle of correlative with conscience, there could be no right motive at all other than disinterested love of duty, and that action is not completely moral unless done exclusively for duty's sake. Reason was not given us, so he holds, to achieve happiness, for this office is far better performed by instinct. Action done from inclination is therefore morally of no value. In order to prove the existence of freedom and duty between the autonomous and the heteronomous, the noumenal and the phenomenal, man, as members of the phenomenal world, the laws of action lie outside us in events and circumstances. In this there can be no question of freedom and morality, but as members of the noumenal world, we are possessors of autonomous will, creating our own moral law. This separation leads Kant into a position which falsifies the facts of inner conflict. It is precisely because we are at one and the same time members of both worlds that duty and interest do conflict. But apart from this, it leads him to a complete rejection of the teleological idea. All pursuit of an end is relegated to the non-moral phenomenal world. The eudaemonist idea, the ontological conception of perfection, is empty and indefinite. It follows, of course, from the critique that, the noumenon being unknowable, there can be no question of discovering what the end of man may be. Any such discovery could only be derived from experience, and therefore could never be universal and necessary. Even supposing, then, that happiness, whatever that may be thought to consist in, ought to be aimed at, still it must be aimed at not because it is an object of desire, but simply for duty's sake, from the motive of respect for the law. The objections to such a position are obvious. It is not possible, wrote Aristotle in the Magna Moralia, to perform virtuous actions without pain or pleasure. The middle state does not exist. And for him, pleasure in virtuous action was a sign that a man was truly virtuous. The virtuous life has no need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but has its pleasure in itself. The man who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call a man just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor any man liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions, and similarly in all other cases. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant. For Kant, on the other hand, a man must be considered to grow in virtue insofar as he excludes pleasure from the virtuous action. In other words, the whole idea of virtues as habitus of the soul is rejected. Education is not a question merely of accumulating a great deal of factual information. This is only the material of knowledge, and the wise man is not he who knows much, but he who possesses the intellectual habitus, whereby to judge rightly of what is presented by experience, as musical ability consists not in acquiring a large repertory, but in having the spiritual and physical skill necessary for the making of music. But as the intellectual virtues, or habitus, disappear in Descartes and some of his scholastic predecessors to give place to a purely materialistic conception of knowledge, so in Kant the whole idea of what we call character, the habitual disposition to act well, is jettisoned. Again, to aim at happiness purely from a sense of duty is surely a psychological impossibility. Kant himself is obliged to admit that perhaps it has never been done, and there can be no obligation to do what is impossible, for, as he himself affirms, ought implies can. Every agent acts to achieve some end, as St. Thomas says at the beginning of his Ethic, for indeed if there is no desire of an end there will be no action at all. There will be no impetus to bring the activity about, and the respect for the law which Kant sets over against desire in reality itself is one of many possible desires. The main characteristics of the theories of the right as opposed to the good, the priority of right and the opposition between duty and interest, are found again in some modern thinkers. The right, they hold, cannot be derived from the notion of the good, for this latter is unknowable, or at least only with difficulty discoverable. The good cannot be the end towards which the right is a means, for duty excludes interest, and it is impossible therefore to do an action both because it is right and also for the sake of something else. To this it may be said, in the first place, that the good is indeed undiscoverable if by good is meant the good of the hedonist. But the same cannot be said of the eudaemonist. We have at least a hazy notion of what human nature is, using the word nature in its metaphysical sense, the common specific possession of all men. We have in consequence some idea of that towards which naturally tends. We cannot doubt that health, wisdom, virtue are the proper objects of an activity, the proper term for growth. Again, are duty and interest incompatible? This takes us back to the point raised in discussing Kant's view. Respect for the law is itself a desire, and as I may desire health both absolutely, because it is a good thing to be healthy, and also for some other reason, such as that I may be able to fulfill this or that engagement, so also I can desire a thing both because it is my good and because it is my duty. As Father Darcy has pointed out, when we have a craving for some object or experience, it is this object or experience which defines the end of our action, and not the pleasure which is attendant upon its attainment. In the appetite for food, it is the food which is desired, and we cannot separate the well-being of the body which results from the eating of this specific food. In knowing, again, it is the object as known. If we separate these two, we find by experience that we miss what we wanted. That is, if we make pleasure the end, the effect is ultimately to destroy the pleasure. Once this is recognized, we have a principle of far-reaching importance. For the first, an object may be desired for its own sake, and be at the same time one of our advantage or happiness. And this, so far from being the exception, appears to be the rule. On the other hand, the theory under discussion seems to have no satisfactory solution of the difficulty of conflicting duties. The honest Jean Malifer in his diary tells us, "At that time, I was so undecided as what condition of life I ought to choose that I had simultaneously two wills in the matter. One, to become a Jesuit, the other, to become a minim. The Reverend Jesuit Fathers dissuaded me from becoming a minim, and the Reverend Minim Fathers from becoming a Jesuit. And as both parties had reasons of practically equal force, I believe both, and was quite unable to choose." The dilemma such as this in the moral life must somehow be decided. I may be convinced that it is my duty to visit a dying friend, and yet at the same time feel equally convinced that it is my duty to stay at home and do my job. How decide? For if ethics is a question of intuition, and if there can be no reference to an end, the problem must remain unsolved unless I am to say that one of my intuitions was mistaken, in which the case of the whole theory is undermined. There is, then, no lack of cogent argument against the theories here considered. Yet, on the other hand, it is surely undeniable that there is much truth in them. Comparative ethics may have scotched intuitionism. It can hardly be said to have killed it. Intuition is distinguished from reasoning or ratiocination as immediate perception from cursive inquisition. The latter is the normal human method of cognition, but it is always, as St. Thomas remarks, striving after more perfect mode, and it can hardly be denied that to some extent we can and do have intuition of the truth. There must be, in human nature, cognition of the truth which is without inquisition, that is intuitive, both in speculative and in practical things. This cognition must be the principle of all that follows, whether speculative or practical, for principles must be more firm or certain. It must be naturally in man, as being the seed, or so to say, of all subsequent knowledge. It must be habitual, ready to be used when necessity arises. And as in the human soul there is a natural habitus, whereby it apprehends the principles of the speculative sciences, so too there is a natural habitus of the first principles of action, which are the natural principles of the natural law. There is no question here, of course, of innate ideas. It is indeed characteristic of the general materialization of thought in the latter Middle Ages that the doctrine of innate ideas should have come to replace the one put forward in this passage. The light of intellect, which is in us, is nothing less than a participated likeness of the divine, uncreated light which are contained in the eternal ratios of things. Whence to the question, who shall show us good things? The psalmist replies, the light of thy face is signed upon us, O Lord, as though to say, by the sealing of the divine light in us all things are proven. Father Horvath comments, this light illumines every man that comes into the world inasmuch as it is shared by him by way of a faculty, naturally ordained to the true, and naturally using the participated light of the divine essence by way of principles in themselves, luminous, perceptible, intelligible. As St. Thomas is careful to point out, this intellectual light is not the sole element in knowledge, as the Platonists held that the participation in the ideas was alone sufficient for the knowledge. We need the senses and the activity of intellect in abstracting the sensibles, the intelligible form. But the natural and habitual light of intellect enables us to grasp intuitively the truth of the first principles when their exemplification in reality is presented to us by the senses. Thus, the principle of contradiction is not infused ready-made into the soul, but there is in the soul the propensity and ability to apprehend and thence to formulate it when we experience offers the material in which it is verified. This is called the first principle, on which all others are founded, for being is what is first apprehended, and the law of contradiction is the assertion that being and non-being are contradictory and therefore incompatible. A thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Now, as being is that which is first apprehended absolutely, so good is what first falls under the apprehension of the practical reason which is ordered to activity. Every agent acts for some end, which has the character of goodness. The first principle of practical reason, therefore, is founded on the character of goodness, which is that the good is what all things desire. And the first precept of the law, therefore, is that good is to be done, pursued, evil is to be avoided. On this are founded all the other precepts of the laws of nature. The good has the character of the end, evil of the contrary. Everything, then, to which man has a natural tendency is apprehended by the reason as good, and therefore to be pursued in action, the contraries of these as evil to be fled. The foundations of morality, then, are intuitively apprehended. Particular judgments are indeed to be deduced from these, but that is the province of ratiocination. And it is here that difference rise, that the other races than our own have other principles of morality, for particular judgments are not concerned with self-evident propositions, and the necessary work of reason may either not be done or be erroneously done. But this fundamental institution But this fundamental intuition is not all. We, in fact, think that many moral laws are self-evident. We do not reach them by a process of reasoning, but apprehend them at once, intuitively, as right. Are such immediate apprehensions to be considered the effect of tradition, heredity, environment, and the rest? It has often enough been argued that this is indeed all that our moral convictions come to, that if we lived in another part of the globe, or another period of the world's history, we should have equally strong convictions that the contraries of our present principles were right, and that therefore such a thing as absolute right is absurd. In view of all that has been said, it is not difficult to reply that though the accidentals of humanity change, human nature in essence does not. That its end therefore remains constant. Moral convictions which are viewed as intuitive must nevertheless be submitted to the scrutiny of reason, since the mere fact that they are accepted by a given race or at a given time do not prove their truth. But it is an argument which in this context should give us pause. On the one hand, it is surely untenable that a people does amass a quantity of moral convictions which, precisely because they are the result of incalculable influences, history, material, environment, climate, manners, and the rest ought to be investigated. Grundyism is in our case an obvious example, but indeed it is questionable whether most of the whole of our present-day morality is not merely the conventionalized residue of what was once more or less a rational ethic, but now has become severed from the principles from which it derived, and altered and degraded by external influences or the ordinary process of inner decay into falsity. There are some things which we take for granted. We are inclined to regard our acceptance of them as intuitive recognition of self-evident truths. In fact, we may merely be following blindly a blind prejudice. Even the first principles have to be subjected to scrutiny. The philosopher must prove their validity, even though the only method of doing so is the method of reductio ad absurdum, as in Aristotle's discussion of triremes in the Metaphysics. On the other hand, ratiocination as was noticed above, is always striving after greater perfection of intuition, and according to St. Thomas, it is the mark of the truly virtuous man that he does, in fact, judge intuitively, where another would have to labor through the processes of discursive reasoning. For the possession of virtue brings about in the soul a connaturality with the virtuous, so that this action is intuitively perceived to be right and that one wrong. A right judgment may be due to one of two things, either the perfect use of reason or a connaturality with the things about which judgment has to be made. In the question of chastity, for example, a man who is learned in moral science will judge correctly through the perfect use of reason, but the chaste man will judge from a connaturality with chastity itself. Such connaturality is not, of course, confined to moral judgments. The intuitions we have of those we love, the aesthetic vision, mystical knowledge, above all the beatific vision, are to be explained on analogous lines. For it is through intuition, the crowning glory of man's intellectual life, that he achieves the fulfillment of another great Thomist principle, that knowledge is not perfect unless it passes into love. since intuition is not merely the apprehension of an object, but its possession in the closest of all possible union. Further, moral action presupposes science, but is itself an art, the art of living. Moral science concerns itself first of all with the general principles, as indeed being a science it must, but the subject of morality is not human action in general, but this or that human action, in this or that set of circumstances, and emanating from this or that personality. Hence, the fact, remarked upon by Aristotle, that ethics cannot be an exact science. There is no set of ready-made rules to be applied to each individual case. The principles have to be applied, but this is the function of the virtue of prudence. And with prudence, as with art, as Maritain points out, each new case is really a new and unique case. Each action is a unique action. What constitutes the goodness of an action is the relation of the mind not to moral principles in the abstract, but to this moral action. Hence, an essential element of quasi-intuition is at least implicit in every willed and chosen action. Intuitionism is wrong in denying the importance of reason in judging of objective moral principles, and in deducing from them more particularized rules of conduct. It is right in affirming the importance of intuition in seizing here and now the character of this individual case in the particular settings of circumstance, and in its relation to a particular personality. This must be the case whether the agent possesses the appropriate virtue, and therefore the possibility of judgment by connaturality or no, but in the perfect state of affairs, when it is St. Thomas's virtuous man who is the agent concerned. The moral action is undoubtedly the issue of a sort of intuition, that which reveals to his mind the character of the action in its particularity and its entirety, and that which causes him, qua virtuous, to sense its moral value or lack of value. In intuitionism, then, it would seem there is much truth. The fact that it is with intuition that we begin, by means partly of intuition that we act, towards intuition that we aim. On the other hand, the theory fails to provide a satisfactory ethic insofar as it fails to provide a firm objective criterion of validity. Similarly, philosophic legalism, the theory of duty for duty's sake, of the primacy of the right, is open to apparently insoluble objections. It surely is in it precisely the corrective which the theories of the good so far considered stand in need. At any rate, it is the divine will which is in question. It offers an orientation which can preclude the danger of egocentricity. The need not necessarily be so, certainly, that God has given a rule whereby men should govern themselves, wrote honest John Locke. I think there is nobody so brutish as to deny. He has the right to do it. We are his creatures. He has goodness and wisdom to direct our actions to which is best. So far so good, but he goes on. And he has power to enforce it by rewards and punishments of infinite weight and duration in another life, for nobody can take us out of his hands. This is the only true touchstone of moral rectitude, and by comparing them to this law, it is that men judge the most considerable moral good or evil of their actions, that is, whether as duty or sins they may be to procure them happiness or misery from the hands of the Almighty. This view seems to breathe the spirit of hedonism, the escaping of pain, the securing of pleasure. This will not save us from egocentricity, but the emphasis on sanctions is not essential to the legalist view. Accept the existence of God and of man, dependence on him, and at once a definite relation arises for consideration. There is a natural obligation on the Son to reverence the Father, a fortiori on the creature to acknowledge the supremacy of the Creator. Any ethical theory which ignores this relationship, which ignores religion, tends to fix man's thoughts upon himself, to be centripetal and non-religious ethics unless they are purely hedonist, must be legalist in the worst sense, stifling. But make God in the center, and at once egocentricity becomes impossible. The whole impetus of action is directed outside the self. This is, of course, the essence of Christianity, and the decay of the Christian spirit is measurable by the degree with which Christianity comes to be regarded as no more than a system of morals. If Christianity was morality, as Blake put it, Socrates was the savior. Christianity is religion, and religion means relationship with God as him to whom, in Thomas's words, is to an unfailing principle we ought to be bound. It means the offering to God of due worship and obedience, and the offering ought to be the offering of the whole man, since it is of the whole man that God, as creator of all being, is master. The immediate acts of religion are sacrifice, adoration, and the like. But besides these, there are innumerable mediate acts which flow from other virtues as prompted and motivated by religion. Innumerable because there is no act which ought not to be directed. Religion, therefore, lifts the whole moral life right out of the rut of formalist codes and Pharisaism and transmutes it into sacrifice and adoration. The ultimate motive of all activity becomes God's will. It only remains then for the grace of Christ to lift it still further through the charity and through the supernatural life. If legalism can be interpreted in this sense, then it cannot be denied that it provides the remedy for self-centeredness and self-seeking. And insofar as it does at least include this element, its claims cannot be ignored. It can at least lead the way towards disinterestedness. And in that, no matter how insoluble the difficulties against the theories in which have been here considered, we cannot but see the essence of sanctity and therefore the fulfillment of the moral life. If the essence of Christianity is love, then the essence of Christian action will have the quality of all action, which love is the moving force, without giving without counting the cost, serving without thinking of self, loving not self but the other. We see, then, as the result of the consideration of teleological and deontological ethics, to be set about with insoluble difficulties. Man cannot ignore his own happiness, his own fulfillment and perfection, even his own pleasure, yet he must be altruistic. He must act from the disinterested motives. He must obey God's will and nothing else, and regard the whole business of conduct in terms of worship. He must act rationally, choosing means to an end, yet his ethical judgments are to some extent intuitive. He must act freely, yet he seems half his time to be a behaviorist. Somehow, if an ethical theory is not to fall foul of the negative test mentioned earlier on, these seemingly irreconcilable elements must be incorporated into it. It remains to be seen whether St. Thomas manages to achieve this result. Chapter 6. The Thomist Moral Theory. The Thomist ethic is primarily teleological. Its basic principles are argued in the Contra Gentiles. Omne agens agit propter finem. Every agent acts for the sake of some end. It is on this principle of finality that the whole theory is built. If an agent did not press on towards some determined achievement, all would be equally indifferent to him. And an agent who was indifferent to many things would not bring about one rather the other, so that it would be impossible for him to act at all. Every agent then aims at some determined effect, and this is called his end. This end is some good, for that at which an agent determinedly aims must be congruous to him, since he would not aim at it unless it possessed some congruity for himself. The goal of every agent then is some good. In the last analysis, it is the summum bonum, the highest good. For every hierarchy of ordered ends, the last must be the end of all those which precede. A physic is concocted that it may be given to a sick man. It is given him that he may be purged. He is purged that he may get slim. He gets slim that he may recover his health. And health is therefore the end of the slimming and the purging and everything else that preceded. In the same way, all things are found to be graded in different degrees of goodness under one supreme good, which is the cause of all goodness. And this cause of all goodness cannot be other than God. How then is God the end after which all things strive? If a thing counts for sake of some other already existing, and something is achieved as a result of its activity, then this must accrue resultant achievement to the thing acted for. So soldiers fight for the sake of their general, and victory, the fruit of their fighting, accrues to the general. But nothing can accrue to God as the result of activity on the part of anything at all, since he is his own perfect good. It remains then that God is the end of all things, not in the sense that he is something achieved or affected by things, or he can benefit at all from the activity of creatures, but in this sense alone, that he benefits them. The end of creatures then is to acquire the goodness of God, that is, to become like to God. And this, not in the manner in which God's perfection exists in himself, since he is wholly simple, but according to their own mode of being, which is to possess perfection, not in the one but in many. A thing is made like to the divine goodness, in all those elements which belong to its own proper goodness, and the goodness of a thing is not in its existence merely, but in all those things which go to make up its perfection, so that things are directed towards God as their end, not only in their essential being, but also in those accidents which go to make up their perfection, and even in their proper activity, for this also belongs to the perfection of a thing. That a thing should attain its own proper perfection, then, is at once God's will for it and its own way of reaching God. Already in this principle, the synthesis of right and good, of eudaimonism, and obedience to God's will may be discerned. The end of every creature is its own self-realization, its own fulfillment. Acorn grows into oak and kitten into cat. Yet it is a metaphysical monstrosity for a thing to seek its own destruction, a necessity for it to seek its own perfection. Every man of spirit, said the Sieur de Brantôme, with lusty exaggeration, wants to try his hand at everything. all things tend towards the compassing of their perfection, is the expression of St. Thomas's view. Omnes appetunt suam perfectionem adipleri, qua est ratio ultimi fini. The theories which then advocate self-destruction in the name of the service of God are not merely sinning against man, they are sinning against God. They advocate and effect a rebellion against God's purposes in creating the world. Man is no exception to the general principle. He is, certainly, a unique expression of it, and this particularity must be discussed. The objective difference, the special way in which he comes to the likeness of God, may be left until later. There is a subjective difference also. Unlike inanimate objects and animals, man is self-conscious and rational. He can decide for himself what is his proper end or good. He is self-determining. He is not simply taught by instinct what the end is, and led by instinct to pursue it. He uses his mind and makes his own decision, and the sense of responsibility resides precisely in the recognition that he is obliged to act so as to attain the end once seen. Physical necessity becomes moral obligation. Reason is the determining factor. But, as we have seen, rational processes are not the whole story. In human nature there must be knowledge of the truth without rational inquiry, both in the speculative and in the practical order. The first principle of activity, itself self-evident, enters into every practical judgment, and rational processes therefore contain an intuitive element. Other intuitional judgments, fruits of heredity, upbringing, and so forth, play their part. Further, the quasi-institution of virtuous man comes gradually to supplant or supplement the purely rational judgments of the man in whom the virtuous habit is not yet formed. Reason remains the judge, the court of appeal. Intuitive assents have, for certitude, to be examined in its light, but the pith of institutionalism is incorporated into rationalism. Man is determining, but, as again we have seen, through this the very basic principle does not contradict the fact, guaranteed by experience, that in practice man is often by no means self-determining. Ignorance, passion, coercion, these lessen or destroy the freedom of actions. Insofar as they do, they carry them outside the realm of morality, for only the free can be morally good or evil. The psychological truth in determinism is salvaged. That truth, once allowed, the limitations of the ethical theory are corrected by the basic assertion of free will, to which experience equally points. Nor is this the only context in which determinism finds a place in Thomism. Just as the quasi-intuition of the virtuous man can supplant rational inquiry, so that the man judges not irrationally, but supra-rationally, so the quasi-determination of the virtuous man supplants the indetermination of indifference, so that he acts not by compulsion from without, but from impulsion from within. Cogit me stimulus amoris. The actions of the lover may be determined. He would rightly deny that they were not free. The fact of this inner impulsion throws light also on the truth contained in the legalist theory. St. Thomas speaks of the first principles of action and the participation of eternal law, and remarks that though every individual finding of practical reason must be reducible to the eternal law, but the eternal law is truth itself. The arbitrariness of some of the legalist theories is excluded. It is in the seeking of his own perfection that the agent fulfills the law, for this latter is not an arbitrarily imposed code, but the order of truth, truth as demanding realization in creative activity, and to this too exclusively self-seeking element is joined in the element of obedience, and obedience to a person who is the object of love. And because love and therefore disinterestedness will grow as the agent comes nearer to his own perfection, since that perfection is primarily to be expressed in terms of union in love with God, it follows that the eudaimonistic element is more fully incorporated and realized as the disinterestedness it needs to correct to become stronger and deeper. There is another point to be noticed. Strictly speaking, there are no sanctions to the Thomist ethic. One has heard it reported of certain academics for the young that the walls are decorated with an influence and protuberant eye, lest the little scholars forget that the grim vigilance of the deity is never relaxed, and that their misdemeanors, be they never so hidden and discreet, will infallibly be observed and they themselves pounced upon and cast into the pit. Small wonder, then, if they emerge from their status pupillaris, they are incurably legalist and negativist, their eyes on the book of rules, their minds absorbed in the problem of not laying themselves open to celestial attack. They never, of course, achieve anything. They become stunted and lifeless. For the motive force of their lives, far from being the possibility of achievement, is the necessity of non-commission. They may indeed be impelled to perform a number of pious acts, thought of as such, for this outlook can never envisage growth in personality, in perfection of state. But it is likely that their motive in performing acts will be merely the hope of avoiding perdition or curtailing as far as possible the duration of their purgatorial time. The Thomist outlook is the exact antithesis to this. Man is free. He can move either towards his end or away from it. He can choose or reject God. He is responsible. And, as, philosophically speaking, it is normally their own fault if he ends in disintegration. So, theologically speaking, if he loses God, it is because he has chosen to do so. We are accustomed to speak of falling into mortal sin, but unhappily we cannot claim the responsibility which falling implies. As the sin is by definition deliberate, so the loss of God is the chosen end of deliberate aversion from him. In practice, of course, we may licitly think in terms of sanctions, and sometimes it may well be our duty to do so, for the human personality is rent with civil war. The spirit lusteth against the flesh, and the flesh against the spirit, and in consequence passion impels us to choose that which speculatively we know ought not to be done, and neglect that which we know ought to be done. The primrose path may be, as the good John Malifer said, un sot chemin, that does not prevent our tripping down it. Therefore, a counter-appeal to the appetites of a salutary thing. It is difficult to balance pleasure against speculative conclusions about the right and the good. Less difficult, at least sometimes, to balance present pleasure against future and protracted pain. Precisely then, because of the division of the personality, a desire to choose the right way may be strengthened by a consideration of sanctions, but it is a particularization of the general eudaimonist principle of growth towards the perfection that the consideration should decrease in emphasis. that the service of fear should give way more and more to the service of love, until the idea of a law attended by sanctions gives way wholly to that of a love which asks to serve, and which, united with the love will, knows no other law. Qui legem dat amantibus? Asked Boethius. Who shall legislate for lovers? And as St. Thomas answered a query about how one might become a saint, not with a list of precepts to be observed, but with one word, velle, have the will to be one. So St. Augustine defined the state of soul which Christianity aims when he said, ama et fac quod vis, love and then do what you will. The lover has, as such, only one sanction, the fear of hurting what he loves. What is it, on the objective side, which distinguishes the way man comes from the likeness of God? For St. Thomas, Aristotle was on the right road to answering the question. Man is not angelus in machina, a spirit in the machine. He is body-spirit, one substance, and this hylomorphism dictates the answer to the ethical question. Some have held that, so far, a perfection of the body being necessary for beatitude, beatitude, on the contrary, requires that the soul be wholly separated from the body. So Porphyrius, quoted by Augustine in The City of God, said that for the soul to be blessed, everything corporeal must be fled. But this cannot be so. It is natural for the soul to be united to the body, and the perfection of the soul, wherefore, cannot exclude the perfect natural to the body. The end of man is not to escape from the body so as to achieve the perfection of the soul. It is to achieve the perfection of the whole man, body and soul together, to create the perfected personality. Hence many difficulties, precisely inasmuch as man is made up of different elements, with various and possibly conflicting potentialities. The perfection of the whole demands first a careful scrutiny, and then a wise and strong control of the claims of each. It is less difficult to say what the creation of the perfected personality is not, in any given individual, than to say exactly what it is. It is not, first of all, the perfecting of any one element to the exclusion of all others. Over-specialization is a danger in ethics as in education. It leads to inhumanity, the denial instead of the perfection of nature. Again, it is not the perfecting of all potentialities without regard to the well-being of the whole. It is not a question of mere self-expression, of blindly obeying all our urges the moment we make themselves felt. A procedure which, however comfortable, must lead in the end to disintegration. The curious thing is how easily this disintegration process seems to be confused with the opposite process of self-perfection or self-realization, so that pious people can raise horrified hands at the ideal of Christian humanism as at a diabolical paradox. There can be no wholeness without the harmonious interadjustment of parts. Coordination implies subordination. The actualization of the various potentialities demands a scale of values to be arrived at through the inquiry to the relative claims of each. Body is less than mind, perfection of the body less adequate to the demands of the person than that of the mind, and physical perfection therefore cannot take precedence over the perfection of the mind. And in knowing itself there is greater and less. A knowledge of bees or bookkeeping is less adequate to the powers of the mind than the possession of philosophical principles, which itself is perfected only in the knowledge of God. The end is not in riches or power or glory, it is God. God is known. Only here does the cognitive power find its adequate object. If we are talking philosophy, where there is no question of beatific vision or supernatural life, still only in the contemplation of God, in some sense or other, can man's true end be perfection, his highest activity be found, as Aristotle pointed out? The singularity of man among creatures is the return of the universe to God. Its end is thus apparent. God in his end, his own perfection, is his end, and these two reduce to the one concept of union with God to the highest possible degree. More is included in this than knowledge. The notion of contemplation indeed implies that the object contemplated is or will become the object also of love. But it is further arguable, first, that our relation to God must be one of worship, since it is of the natural perfection of the creature to acknowledge its Creator. It is to him, in St. Thomas's words, that we ought principally to be bound as to an unfailing principle. And again, everything is perfected by submission to its superior, so that the perfection of the soul is to be found in submission to God. Secondly, if we accept as demonstrable the idea that God is love, our essential relationship to him must be one of love. That, according to St. Thomas, is a law of nature. Whereas, then, irrational creatures seek their end exclusively for their own sake, as an object of concupiscence, man must seek his end with amor animosité, as an object of personal love, and with obedience as an object of worship. From the attainment of the end, joy must, of course, spring, for there is a cause of joy. And just as the idea of sanctions is admissible so long as it does not become the principle of preoccupation and oust the idea of disinterested service, but on the contrary become gradually more and more subordinated to this latter, so the idea of happiness, in the sense of subjective beatitude, or the sum of pleasures, is admissible, is indeed escapable. But we must be coordinated with the idea of disinterested love.